We usually start recording as soon as we're all connected because with us, you just never know when something hilarious is going to happen.
Yes, I usually try to wait 10 minutes because I know for 10 minutes something funny won't happen. We time it to that sense. But it's good to know your numbers. That works well for you.
Well, if we cut out every unfunny 10 minutes of our show, they would not be an hour long.
It would actually be a reasonable length show.
Hey everyone ever, and welcome to the 20th Century Popcast, the show where we try to understand the present while living in the past. My name is Tim Blevins. The next name is normally Bob Canning, but not today. Today, Bob is not here, but that's no reason to unsubscribe. That's no reason to go and check if 80's All Over has a new episode up. Instead of Bob, I've got two stellar guests here today to discuss with me a topic for you. I'm not in Bob's place, but kind of from their own places, their own vantage points. I'm doing so great with this, but do you guys want to introduce yourself? Start the show off, introduce who's here with me today.
I'm going to toss this over to Jarf. I'm always the guy talking, so I'm going to let Jarf take the lead.
It's my chance at last.
Right?
So,
I could text you what I just said, and you could do the whole show if you wanted.
yes. So this is Jarf, and Brad and I co-created a podcast of which he is the host called the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. So that is our pop culture, entertainment, broad base, talk about anything podcast.
So you say, first of all, thank you. First podcasting guest I've had on the show. You're saying it's a talk about anything podcast. Brad, I know you from the Flash Gordon Minute. That's how I kind of found out about you. So in terms of Cosmic Geppetto, I understand talk about anything. If you had to give a sentence kind of tagline for it to kind of funnel into something, so like listeners to coming to a show about pop culture be like, oh, I see what that is. What would the heart of that show be? What is that exactly?
The tagline.
Give them the tagline, Brad.
Yeah, the tagline we like to say, and our wonderful voice of the show, Beth Reynolds says, is where we talk about movies, music, books, comics, and whatever else we feel like. And so basically, if it's anything geeky, we're going to talk about it. The show started, it was actually under a different name. We used to call it Movies That Marvel because we were going to talk about the movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it took us about 3 episodes to just completely ditch that format because we started talking about soundtracks to these movies, and which is actually our first conversation about Flash Gordon was by the soundtrack. And then so we basically talk about stuff that's geeky. We try to be as inclusive and positive as humanly possible. So if you're looking for someone to, if you're looking for a show to talk about how much the Fantastic Four movies stink, that's not really us. Don't get me wrong. We agree that those movies stink, but instead we go with it from a perspective of what do we like about this property? What do we want to see? How we actually have a sub-series where we talk about fixing our favorite franchises or what should be our favorite franchises. So it's a fun place to go for a weekly podcast. The episodes are usually about an hour or so long. We're going to talk about our favorite albums, stuff that we're excited about. We've had a wonderful chance to talk with some great writers and comic book artists and documentary producers and some sort of indie artists. And it's sort of a fun place to sort of be inclusive and be positive and just have a great time. And we have a panel of about 20 regular panelists that go in and out of all the episodes, and great perspectives and some great voices. So it's we're trying to just talk about anything geeky and stuff that we love and try to share that stuff we love with our listeners.
Now, do you find like it's and as an angle, it's almost how that one would have to say, the positivity of it. Do you find that in fandom in general that's a difficult thing to maintain? Do you bump against that sometimes yourself, like in talking about popular culture you've had your whole life?
I wouldn't say that I bump up against it just because I think that we've created this nice bed of positivity and we've really drawn people that want to have those fun and positive conversations.
Why do you think there's like an opposite to that? What do you think? Because I think that's great. And I notice it a lot, like most recently talking about the most recent Star Wars movie, which I enjoyed, talking with friends who grew up with that, who did not care for the movie. It takes an ugly turn. It takes an odd turn of just, there is a self-centeredness of how much it impacts them. Why do you think the clinging of that is difficult for some people to break away? And have you ever had to deal with that yourself? Like, have you felt that, the negative side of that?
We're in a weird world where, and it's a social media world where you want to get likes and you want your tweets to be retweeted. And the easiest way to do that is not to have a medium warm opinion about something. Nobody's ever going to care if you give Black Panther a B grade. Yes, you have to say it's either the greatest thing that ever happened or it's the worst thing that ever happened. And it was funny, we just had a podcast where we had the amazing Zach Luna from Spider-Man Minute on, who actually worked on costumes for Black Panther. And it was weird for me. I said, it's like, here's the thing. I didn't love the movie. I liked it a lot, but I didn't love it. And I said, it's weird because I've seen a lot of people who, there's the backlash or the anger that always happens when the movie feels different to them because they feel threatened. Or there's the people where it's the greatest thing that ever happened. And I was like, it's weird for me being in a middle period. But I didn't. And I think that's what it is. It's hard to have a just middle of the road, hey, I thought it was good. These are the things I like. These are the things I didn't, because that isn't what catches eyes and gets interest on social media. And in podcasting world and in people who do the YouTube videos or something, that isn't of interest to people.
Do you think that was always there, though? Like something like that, and it's hard to think back, because I mean, I don't know all of our ages, but we lived through the original Star Wars movies, as an example, right? Were you fans and saw them when they came out and all of that?
Well, I think what's different is what Brad was touching on there about this being filtered through social media. I don't think it is just human nature to only care about the extreme ends of reactions, the love and the hate. But since social media uses this content neutral algorithm and only amplifies what is getting the most attention, I've read some interesting studies about how people are more likely to respond to something that triggers an extreme emotion for them. So if someone's saying that a movie is outrageously horrible and so deeply offensive, then that is going to make them hit that angry face. Conversely, if they're saying, oh, I left the theater in tears, it was beautiful, that is my review of Wrinkle in Time, by the way. But it's going to make them hit that love button, and so you just get more of that.
There is like this broadcast angle to it, I guess, and because like I feel like we all of us do pop culture centric podcasts, and we'll get into today's topic in a minute. It's interesting. It just struck me that in a good way that you have this angle, and it shouldn't seem so strange, but that your angle is positivity when it's kind of like, I think everyone who does a pop culture show, not everyone, that's a generalization, but a lot of people want it to be like, this is just like a regular conversation I would have with my friends. This is how we talk about Gem and the Holograms. This is how we talk about The Cure or whatever. But those kind of conversations are personal. I don't think they necessarily translate to an audience when you're so like, with a microphone like right now, with the headphones and everything, there is a degree of maybe playing for an audience. Do you not encounter that? Like there is an angle of having to make it seem like, well, if someone's going to listen for half an hour or an hour, not to manufacture it, but what are they going to listen to? And it can't just be a rattling off a list of memories, but a discussion, I guess, kind of at that angle.
Yeah, and you also see what succeeds. I remember when Rush Limbaugh first broke onto the scene, and Rush Limbaugh's whole thing is just very one side of the issue, and everyone who's with him is good, everyone who's against him is bad, and trashing the other side. And there are people, and then I also remember when Air America came in, that was sort of like the left-leaning radio network, and it was some people were on the other side doing the exact same thing, and you realized. And then I remember just reading articles and sort of people who were on the inside is like, some of these people believe about 20% of what they say, but you don't get the rabid following, and the people who then go to your advertisers and stuff like that by being, well, I sort of agree, I sort of disagree, and that isn't what draws ears. And people paid attention to that, and it became and unfortunately, it sort of led to that sort of broadcasting philosophies like, hey, have strong opinions and don't give an inch.
Does it seem odd that happens with pop culture? Like Rush Limbaugh, a horrible individual who speaks of politics, what's his name with InfoWars now, like those kind of things. These are horrible, raging, insane people who are talking with their reptilian conspiracies and with these other things. They're talking politics. So theoretically, it's something that impacts all of us. It's interesting to see. And I don't think it's odd. It makes sense because these things, I think, impact us. But it's sometimes I have to step back and say, like, we're treating the Inhumanoids cartoon from 1986 with that same sort of extreme one side or the other discussion. I guess I don't know where that comes from. I mean, I do this week after week podcast where we discuss Tom Hanks in Big, where we discuss Howard the Duck. And there is an aspect of how do we talk about that for an hour? It's because we're going back to nostalgia. There's all these different filters to go through. It's interesting, and I find it can be hard. And again, this is going back to how maintaining this idea of positivity, it can almost be hard sometimes to just discuss the fond memories because I don't know. It's like I've gone through that, and just talking about them and discussing them. It's interesting that this becomes the conversational currency or political conversation, I guess, a discussion.
I think there's also a dangerous thing that happens when the new Star Wars comes out, and this is such a beloved franchise that's been around for so long. And what can also happen is there's a term that Jarf has thrown around a lot, a couple times rather, headcanon, where you create your whole little world for the things that you love, and there can be a dangerous thing where people get so passionately involved because I've had my Spider-Man movie in my head for the last 30 years. And some people can't let go that when that movie comes out, hey, that's not what my Spider-Man wouldn't look like Andrew Garfield. And Amazing Spider-Man comes out, and it's, I think, admittedly a below-average movie, but people are angry because not only was it was a below-average movie that doesn't match the Spider-Man they had in their head, and they're so invested in what's in their head going onto the screen. So, it becomes so personal for everyone. And yeah, listen, I read a lot of Fantastic Four comic books growing up, and I, loved I read most of the issues of the Thing solo series, and I had my idea of what would make a cool story. And then the 2015 Fantastic Four film came out, and it wasn't a good movie. That's okay. It's okay. There was some interesting things about it. It was at least an interesting failure. And you know what? We're also in an era where, hey, listen, folks, if it doesn't work, don't worry. They can try again. It's not like when Superman Quest for Peace came out and it was such a bomb and such a artistic failure that they shut down Superman for 15, 20 years.
That's true. And maybe they shut that down maybe 2 years too late, possibly 4 if we count Superman 3. But I think you said two things there, and this will segue into today's topic a little bit. I mean, one, I think the thing that everybody forgets is that there's always another chance. Like, we've seen it. We've seen 3, we're seeing multiple Batmans in a decade, that these things, we don't have to be as invested in the immediate one. And it is odd that that's the world we live in, that if like the Star Wars doesn't match what I remember, this can't be a good Star Wars. Like that mindset I don't get. But the other side of it is these are things, you're talking about how it sounds like you grew up reading Fantastic Four. You read them when you were younger. I mean, that's when we encounter these things. That's when we know of these things without any other prior knowledge, without the pop culture weight of it. Like, to keep going back to Star Wars was the thing I grew up with. It wasn't this juggernaut till later on. So I think we tend to forget the impact of it when it first hit us. And that's kind of what I think, at least on this show, we are always trying to get at, is what were these things when we first encountered them? Because as time goes on, you're looking back at something and, you do change as a person, and you want to, or at least I know, I want to hold on to that thing as I remember it was in 1984, but that's not going to stick as I develop, kind of thing. But so to be able to talk about that, it's almost like a luxury that we're able to talk for an hour about these topics, and I do enjoy that. But yeah, it is odd that it takes energy for some, sometimes myself included, to maintain an upbeatness with that. And so thank you for kind of opening that up a little bit, because it is something I think about a lot.
Well, I give credit to Jarf. Jarf is like the conscious of the show, so he keeps me.
I'm the Jiminy Cricket, and positivity was one of the earliest conversations that we had, because we looked at what we were starting to do and looked at how it was hitting the larger world of pop culture.
Starting
podcasts.
To do in terms of podcasts, okay.
Yes, and we saw that there was this trend of, I'm going to do a series of YouTube videos and talk about how much I hate everything. And I wasn't even really thinking of it as a larger political thing. It was just, why? If you hate it that much, why are you spending so much time podcasting about it? So we really wanted to just offer a balance of that and something that would be more fun.
But you were putting it together as a show, correct? You were putting it together as, so what, and if you don't mind if we derail the episode, I'm finding a lot of interest in what you're both bringing to how people view pop culture, because I think both of you seem to have a very keen view of how you're viewing pop culture. Would you mind if that's what we wind up talking about right now? Would that throw every note into the wind?
No, hell, let's have fun.
Is that good for you? Well,
no, I find it very interesting. So yeah, I'm down.
Okay. I mean, it does mean I have to delete 3 paragraphs of notes and 2 jokes, but I can do that. I can do that right now.
Keep your notes. We'll turn it into a Cosmic Geppetto episode later. We'll have you on our show. We'll turn we'll turn the tables.
I can also just forward them to you. I'll bold the parts that get laughs. Let me do that. but so in terms of so you started Cosmic Geppetto started as a discussion of Marvel movies.
Yep.
Right.
What prompted you to think, let's turn this into a discussion people are going to, because what prompted you to make a podcast out of that?
Well, it did start out as a podcast. It just initially was the Movies That Marvel podcast. And we had, I would say, more modest aspirations for the reach of it, and both in terms of people, as guests, as listeners, and the thematic reach of it. And I think what started us down the road of changing both the name and the format was, Brad, your interview with Lori Lindeen, right?
Yeah, Lori Lindeen, the ex-wife of
Paul Westerberg. I love Lori Lindeen.
We mentioned her on an episode of the show, and I emailed her and said, "Hey, we mentioned you on the episode of this show," and she replied back, and then we had a little bit of a conversation, and she agreed to come on the show. And she wrote a book, an autobiography called Pedal Pusher. Mm-hmm. Excellent book.
Yeah.
And
Zuzu's Pedals, that was her band, right? Zuzu's Pedals?
Yeah. Zuzu Pedals. Great book, and it was a wonderful interview. But what was funny is she says, like, I don't really know anything about comic book movies, because that was what the show was about. And I had to say, no, it's fine. And then we had this great interview and just about her book and her writing, so it didn't really fit into format. We made it work because we tagged it with a discussion about the Punisher movies, and which wasn't a great fit, but okay, it worked. And then we was like, hey, if we got her, who else could we get? And I found out when we were shooting out emails to get other guests, I spent the first 2 paragraphs saying, hey, this is what we do, but this is what we want to do with you. And I said to Jarf, it's like, we can actually get some great guests. I don't feel like wasting 5 minutes explaining why they should be on the show, even though they have nothing to do with the show. And that's when we changed the name, and we changed the format to, and again, it was supposed to be once a week, once every other week, talking about a Marvel movie. The first episode we talked about Iron Man. The second episode we talked about the Hulk, and then we did 4 episodes talking about movie soundtracks that had nothing to do with Marvel.
That would have been a great topic for this show, movie soundtracks. That's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, what a great idea. So it was getting harder to get. We spent too much time making excuses for who we were to guess, and then we're having a tough time keeping to the format. It's like, and it just, I think we were 20 episodes in. It's like, why are we fighting this? Let's just let the show become what it is. Basically, like this episode. This episode, we were supposed to be talking about, Queen music.
I know, which would be great. Which would be great, but...
And we are actually recording it on Christopher Lambert's birthday, by the way.
Are we really? Today? This actual day? He still has birthdays? Even though he's
birthday,
he's
Highlander.
More character than actor now? Good for him. Great for him. But the of the show, like the parameters were still pop culture based, correct? Is that...
We rarely go into anything. We rarely go into politics.
Well, that's when things turn very ugly, I assume. It's very hard, I think, to have a civil, polite, although it's hard to have a civil, polite conversation about the X-Men, but it's hard to have a civil, polite conversation about politics, I would imagine.
Yeah, and especially if I'm hosting it, because Jarf's pretty plugged in politically. I just sort of have my opinions, but I don't make any claim to be like a real student of the game. If you want to go for a political conversation, go to the Gist, go to Pod Save America. Those are the people who really know what they're talking about.
Yeah, Pod Save the People,
I feel like,
too.
Yeah. There's some great other content out there. However, I feel like what I can really bring to the game is I can, first off, I feel like I'm a pretty good interviewer, and I feel like I can offer a good, fresh perspective on these pop culture things with a pretty wide berth. I'm lucky where I read a lot of books, I read a lot of comics, I watched a lot of movies, and I have a lot of music. So I'm dialed in to a pretty wide swath of pop culture where I can talk Star Wars intelligently, I can talk, Ben Folds music intelligently. I can talk Flash Gordon intelligently, and I'm sort of a jack of all trades in that way. So basically, the things that I'm not good at is, financial talk and politics.
But through pop culture, I'm going to take back something I just said, because I feel like through something like the X-Men, pop culture does, at least for me, and I don't know for both of you, is a filter to talk about some of these things. And I'm not exactly sure why, because there are people who love sports, so what they talk about is sports, and they see the world that way. And there are people who it's their politics. Pop culture, and I think until very recently, pop culture was oftentimes, at least the pop culture I was into, 80s cartoons, toys, things like that, was kind of relegated to kids stuff. It's odd that in the past 10 years, 12 years, it's become, I think, a public metaphor for discussing things. I mean, I know this is breaking into this century to talk about it, but I don't know what that switch is. I do find it's healthy. I mean, is there stuff that you're into, pop culture that you're into from your past, that there was a time where you wouldn't be talking about it openly, where you would have been private about it? Has that ever been a sensation for either of you? Something where it's like, oh, I'm too ashamed to admit how much, that I'm enjoying the Sectaurs action figure or something along those lines?
Well, we did a bit on a recent show where we have a great panelist, Katie, and anytime she's on, she comes up with Katie's question. So her question the last time that we recorded with her was, what's the geekiest thing that you're into? And I really struggled to answer it because I think that I've outgrown the idea of guilty pleasures. So now there's no shame to my game.
Well, is that across the board? Like, is the idea of a guilty pleasure, which again, I feel was always something like a hokey movie like Xanadu, or a hokey album like Xanadu. Like, do you think that is kind of a thing of the past? Like, do you think, because it's a good moment to be what used to be called a geek, because that is the dominant culture right now. Do you think, I mean, it's a good thing not to have that embarrassment, but do you think there's something now missing where we don't have these private, like a guilty pleasures always seem to be like the thing you watch in private, not necessarily in shame, but something that brought you joy, but you don't have that anymore, you're saying. Is that true?
What I find really fulfilling now is what Brad's touched on a couple of times in working to make geek culture more inclusive. So we're just aware that these spaces, the comic book store and canon discussions of classic comic books, they have not always been welcoming and friendly to women and people of color and LGBT plus fans just because it's like someone's felt ostracized, finds geek culture as something that they connect with, and then they become very defensive of that. And so they are in turn ostracizing other people because they play this kind of gatekeeping role of you're not a real comic book fan, and when that intersects with other larger political and racial issues, then it can really become damaging to people who share our fandom. So we really want to kick down all of those walls, and I just love hearing other people's take on things that I enjoyed as a kid and that I enjoy now, and to have those conversations.
Well, it sounds like it's almost like concentric circles. There was a time where if you had to go back to this topic, because it was the first comic book I realized was political, to identify with the X-Men in the 80s meant a lot to me for being like an outsider and all that. So I have that protective of it. So there are people who make that comic, who are writing it, who are drawing it, who are telling the stories I want to hear. However, I'm relating to it as, this middle American male, boy. So I have that connection to it. There's a circle, a ring further out where people would look at comic books as kids material. You're going to talk about that. Let's talk about, something else, some literature, some sports, whatever. So there's that level. Maybe that's where some of the defensiveness comes from. But then there's another circle that I didn't participate in, which is almost like you don't get this. I'm, almost like and I love the movie, but I feel like Kevin Smith's Mallrats kind of presented a version of a fan that is like this very abrasive, aggressive fan. And I feel like that poisoned the minds of a lot of people. It was entertaining in the movie, but that stuck people where it's like you have to grip your fandom and you have to be isolated from it. And I do feel like that was an aspect of 80s and 90s that maybe is changing now. Do you think that's more the fandom? Do you think that's the people making the art? Like, to stick with comic books, do you think comic books are more inclusive than they used to be? Do you think there's more of a fan base for it? Or do you think it's in the stories themselves, the writing is becoming more inclusive of diversity and that's drawing people in? Or do you think these people have always been there and now it's just representing people to read it who are looking for more diverse characters than another rich white man in an iron suit?
Well, you see a real push and pull. So if you're talking just about the major comic companies, so they'll make some strides to be more inclusive, both in terms of representation of the characters, and then with not as fast of a pace as I'd like to see in the writer's room. And then they'll pull it back. Like, you really see Marvel pulling back with their relaunch of their characters, and they recently announced this return to the classic characters, and of 16 characters, only 2 of them are women, and there's only 1 woman writer among all of those of the main flagship characters. So it really goes back and forth. But with indies, that's where you see a lot more of a variety of voices getting a chance to write from their own experiences.
And is that work you're talking about the space of a comic book store. That's where I went to find that stuff as a kid, more so in college. Like, that's where I first found like Love and Rockets, Strangers in Paradise, years later, Lumberjanes, things like that. Like, that was always the comic book store. Do you think the comic book store still represents that? Do you think that's kind of a social spot for this? Like, is that an inclusive area, or has it spread to bookstores, internet, people do stuff online? Like, where is that change coming from?
I think comic book stores are usually pretty good. There always being exceptions, of course. I think where it can be a real dangerous space, or a less inviting space, is Comic-Cons. And hey, I love going to a Comic-Con. We just were invited to present a panel at a Universal Con in Baltimore, which we're really excited about. But we have we're friends with with Queers Play, who basically their job is they've taken upon themselves to be a safe space at comic book conventions, because it can be really toxic. And there's a lot of that protectiveness, with a dash of misogyny.
Sure,
which is never a good combination.
It's not. It sounds like I might be misguided here. I was thinking because of the greater acceptance of things like cosplay just in society. I thought con spaces were becoming safer places. I don't mean safer, but I thought they were more inclusive places. And it sounds like they're not. That I've been to like Boston Con. I haven't gone to a much bigger than Boston Comic Con in a few years. But
if you're a cisgender woman who's thin and you're cosplaying, then on one level it's going to be accepting for you, and then on another there are some real hazards because people take cosplay as an invitation for unwanted touching. What Queers Play is really great about highlighting is there are people that enjoy cosplay that don't look like characters have always been drawn in the comics, but they still draw inspiration from this character, so they want to create their version of Hawkeye and not have to answer a lot of bullshit questions. Is this a podcast on which we can swear?
It is now that that's out there. Let me just change my rating in iTunes. No, of course it is. You go ahead. It's a real crapshoot, but go ahead. No, yes, you can.
Yeah, so not having to deal with all of these shitty questions of like, oh, are you Hawkeye? And so I think it's important what they do. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a thing of, okay, you don't have the build of Harley Quinn in the comics because nobody does. And also, so there's that. It's like, hey, you can be a normal sized human being and still dress as the characters that you want. And also the thing, and I just saw, I think a post on Facebook, and one of it was a woman who posted how she, comics were the love of her life, and it's where she, got her inspiration, and she learned, developed her love of reading. And somebody said, it's like, oh, well, let's see how big a fan you really are. Who's Squirrel Girl? And it said very clearly in her like bio that she is a writer for Marvel Comics. And she actually posted a picture. She posted a screenshot of a Marvel comic with her name on the front cover circled. She's like, I work and write for Marvel, and still I have to answer these crappy questions. Because I'm a girl, all of a sudden I need to be like 20 questions about, name my three Iron Man villains, or, name 5 Green Lanterns or something like that. There's that weird peppering with questions. And that can be where sort of some of the toxicity can come from, where because people are protective, and when you see a new fan or you see somebody who doesn't look the way you think a normal comic fan should, instead you question to make them feel like they don't belong, as opposed to, oh, well, who's your engaging in a conversation is like, oh, I see you're getting that. I love that. And
that's still going on then. Like, I feel like that was the comic fandom I knew in the 90s, and it was gross and it was overbearing, and I'm happy that I didn't get too caught up in it. But that is still going on. And you do see it. I see it a lot on Twitter. I do see a lot of writers of comics who are basically verbally assaulted with these questions. And I guess I wonder why. I mean, I know that, growing up, the boys' aisle of the toy store were the things I went to, but I don't think I ever thought, I didn't have the gender specificity to it, because I also had She-Ra dolls, Gem dolls. Like, it wasn't necessarily like this is the only aisle you can play in. Why are all these pop culture topics? Why are the fandoms so misogynistically male? I mean, is that maybe that's an obvious answer, but it's true. That's the predominant issue. It seems like, thanks to things like the internet, as more of a diverse audience finds a voice, which is what most of this seems to be, is finally we have other people, like, at least for me, I'm hearing other people talk about comics who aren't my close circle of the concentric circle of friends. Why is this? It's great, but why? It's still a struggle. In the industry, and I guess, why are comics? Why did they start out as male things? Why are these things? Because they're not continually male dominated. Because there's a fandom, obviously, that's not just the angry, bitter fanboy mentality that's there. That's not the only audience for it. I guess, why is that so difficult? I mean, I know why it's difficult for people to grasp, because people hate change and they're fearful, but why is that so difficult for, say, the industry to represent if the fandom is there? Like, to sadly think of it as just a money thing. There's a fandom for your books, for diverse writers and books. You know, the Batwoman was having a huge following when they cut short her planned wedding and kicked the writer off. It's like, why do that? You have, if all you're worried about is the money, which you shouldn't be, but if it is, you have your fandom there. Why is it still a fearful? Why is pop culture so male driven? Where does that come from? Is that a simple statement like that's how the world works? I don't think so. But why is that still a specter there in the 21st century?
I think it becomes self-perpetuating, where, I don't know, at some point comics were written for boys, and because they were written by guys were the one who wrote it, and the boys read them and the girls thought they were silly, and then it became self-perpetuating, and then it became girls aren't into comics. Well, that's because it's all written by guys, and they're all, you have your female characters written for the female gaze. I mean, written for the male gaze.
Mm-hmm. But did you have those thoughts growing up? Like, did you read comics growing up? Did both of you guys read comics?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Was it in your mind that it was a male genre, a male medium? Was that there?
Yeah, I never really gave it any thought, except for one point. I read something where it was pointed out that there was, between DC and Marvel, there are 50 comics published, and only 2, and someone pointed out that of all the comics that were being published, the longest running character with a female lead at that particular point was She-Hulk, which was like at issue 60.
And for me, I grew up in a very small town in central PA. So in my mind and imagination, there were only a half a dozen people in the world who were even into comic books. I didn't really have this sense of a culture of fandom. It was just me and my couple of friends, and we liked comics. And
how does that sit with you at age 10 or whatever you were, that I'm doing something that not many people are into?
If I'm really honest with myself, there is something that is fulfilling with sharing something that's your own little thing with your friends.
Okay, sharing is still in that sentence too, so there is some group mentality, but it is, and like you said, I mean, I grew up in a very small town too, so maybe I can relate to some of this. It wasn't so much that I felt isolated, it's just this, like, my exposure was just, I and my 3 friends read comics. We go to the comic book store together, so that's what that was. Were you protective or fearful of it getting out to people that you read comics? Was it a secret thing? Did you not talk about it in school, or was it part of the conversation anyways?
No, I always liked being the funny guy. So I was always rocking the Tick t-shirt and wearing that on my sleeve. So it didn't help my dating life in high school, but... Oh,
I'm sorry. School's the best, isn't it? No, it's not, but... Yeah. Brad, I'm going to take that moan as perhaps as you have something to say. What was your take on comics in high school? What was your position with them?
It was actually a little challenging for me. And it didn't help that I was in no way, shape, or form cool. So it wasn't just I was a comic book guy. I was also a theater guy. And I also was a bit of a reader. I was like, wow. And I wasn't an athlete. I was like, oh, I have so many strikes against me. And I remember once reading an issue of Comicscape. There was a magazine about comics, and I'm just reading it in the
Comic Scene or something like that.
Yeah, Comic Scene. Thank you.
Comic Scene. Okay.
Yeah, and it had a picture of Swamp Thing on the front, and people are like, "Oh, that's just so gross. Why are you reading that?" And I was like, "Oh, this is now making me uncomfortable."
Grody to the max, man.
Yeah. It's funny. There is and we've talked about this before, Jarf and I, and we've talked about it on the show, where there is a jealousy where you walk down a street or you're at a park or something, and you see so many cool kids, it seems like, or so many 20-somethings wearing a Marvel shirt.
Yeah, that's when I become a jerk, because I'm like, you're not suffering for your Green Lantern underoo or whatever. Yeah, and that's
you
weird.
You can see their underoos?
Does that come... those of us with the X-ray glasses we got from the back of the comic can. Also, I can make a $5 bill turn into a $1 bill with this crank. But no, I will say, like, I think I know the feeling, and I should let you actually say it. I'm sorry, I totally cut you off, but just because I've had that feeling, and I hate myself when I have that feeling, because I'm becoming the jerk. I'm being like, how dare you carry the copy of Watchmen around in 2008? That book's been around for however many years. It's just a movie coming out. That was the one I remember. I was sick of seeing everybody with their Watchmen. I'm like, people are reading the book you like. You can talk to people about the book now. Well, however they got to it, they got to it. But that's where this weird, and I wonder if this is a weird misogynistic thing or if it's just human nature. But like, that's when I last felt possessive of this genre of comics. Like, I really felt like you don't deserve it. And that's weird, man. That's the antithesis of, or that's what generates, that's tying into the feeling of being an outsider. And now suddenly being like, you can't do it is just turning that on someone. Like, you do have that feeling a little bit, or I've had it, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it's so counterproductive because, listen, I love the Marvel movies, and I love that they spent $200 million to film and create this amazing world for Avengers Infinity War.
You don't feel like maybe that's $2 million too much?
It might be. And
like just by 2 million though. The 190 would
yeah, just by 2 million. The 198 would have been perfect.
I think so.
And that movie doesn't get made if it's just me and Jarf and our friends going to see that movie. It has to be a fan base that just thinks it looks like a cool movie. My parents love going to the Marvel movies. They never read a comic book their entire life. They like to go to those movies because, aside from the fact they're based on comics, but they're still, in general, satisfying movies. And
also, isn't your mom hot for Thor?
Oh, geez, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the most recent haircut Thor, I would agree. Actually, eye patch Thor, not the one who normally enjoys an eye patch, but yes, stunning, very stunning. I will agree with your mom on that. But to circle back for a minute, like, so there is there is that rationale that we need the fan base to make this $200 million movie. But does it ever get you that none of these people are reading comics? That the comic industry is suffering, even though the movie, like, what's saving Marvel right now is their movies. I don't, and maybe I'm speaking out of line, but I think that's right.
I think the trades are doing decent because they expand to a different market and they sell in bookstores and online. It's the single issues that are struggling, which makes it a challenge for starting up new books.
It's a thing where when we were reading comics in the peak in the 90s, where Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man 1 sold 2 million copies, and the Jim Lee, Chris Claremont X-Men issue 1, I think, sold 7 million.
Yeah, I think that was the highest selling comic at the time, or maybe it was the McFarlane. Both of those broke records, I believe. I do remember that.
And now a success is if you can sell 50,000 units. But keep in mind that back in the 90s, they went bankrupt. They were having bankruptcy issues because even though they were selling so many comics, the company wasn't financially sound. And now Marvel, the entity, makes billions of dollars. So it's almost like comics have sort of become a testing ground for the cartoons and for the movies. And in one way that's disappointing because it's a comic book company. They should be selling comics. But on the other hand, as long as they are having opportunities and those ideas, and the look of Thor from Thor Ragnarok, that was tested out in the comics first. And you have that, and like using it as like sort of a testing ground to see what people are into. Captain America Civil War was a take on a comic book that had come out 10 years before then. So basically the purpose of comics has changed. It's like, okay, it's going to have a smaller audience, but it's, the things that work and that get people excited, they're going to be something that can then be sort of parlayed into big screen for a mass audience. It's not really what you want, but but Marvel, I now feel comfortable that Marvel's going to be around for another 20, 30, 40 years. And during that period when they were going bankrupt, I think at one point, Marvel was owned by Revlon.
That I did not know, but that explains some of the more gamma irradiated blush that I used. So that makes sense.
I learn something every time I podcast with Brad. He's always got some kind of nugget of knowledge that he will unearth.
No, is it always Revlon based? Because there's a lot to know about Revlon that I'm unaware of.
You never know what it's going to be.
Sometimes it's L'Oreal.
That's awesome.
Right.
Okay, so this guy does know his stuff. That feeling that you were talking about when you see the 20-something in the shirt, in the whatever superhero shirt, that momentary feeling, to me, the key to understanding how pop culture evolves, or how I evolve with pop culture, is in there somewhere. And I guess it's like, what is that? Is that tinge sort of, that item is mine? Is that tinge sort of, you don't know what it's like to be made fun of for, like, it's, you were talking about like in high school, kind of having to hide your Swamp Thing book. Like, is it not earned? And I'm not saying this is how you feel, but in that moment, because I think we have emotional reactions to things that speak to something else. Like, where do you think that comes from? I mean, for me, I know I do hold on to a little bit of that. This wasn't cool when I was in high school. Why is it cool now? But where does that tinge come for you?
Yeah, I think it's jealousy, because I remember there was one brief shining moment in '89 where it was cool, because when the Michael Keaton Batman movie came out, all of a sudden everybody was wearing Batman shirts in my high school, and I was thrilled because I wasn't even a huge Batman fan. I was always a Marvel guy, but I got my butt right out to the store. I got a Batman shirt that had a Brian Boland Batman picture on the front, and I was so happy. And then in 2 months, all of a sudden everyone stopped wearing it, and I would get weird looks now. I was like, why are you still wearing that shirt? I was like, oh, this isn't going to last forever.
But we're in that era now where it does, which is weird. I don't know for how long, but I have friends younger than me, and I'm just like, I do find that thing of being, I become that old man where it's like, well, you don't know what it's like to own a Dazzler comic book in public. Like, you don't know what that feels like, which is odd. That's that weird part of, it's not toxic masculinity, but there's something that drives that. I guess I'm wondering, why is fandom driven by that to a degree? Do the things that resonate with us the most, our fandom for Star Wars comics is what we're talking about, so we'll stick with that. Does some of that come from almost like a survivor's thing? Like, it's kind of like, this was my testament to surviving high school because I had carried my polybagged books around. Is there something in pop culture that is so, because Jeff, you were saying, like, with your friends, it was just a few of you who are into comics. Is there something to that then makes comics important, or more important than maybe just the books themselves?
I've realized a couple of things as you've been talking about this. One thing that inoculated me against that feeling of, oh, someone can't enjoy this if they don't have the same background, or they haven't had the same experiences with it, they haven't grown up with the comic in the way that I did, is the fact that I was involved in the punk scene in the 90s.
Oh.
And I saw a negative aspect of that scene where they could be very sanctimonious and not accepting of someone like me who was newer to it, because I didn't grow up near a city and know a lot of people who were involved in it. I grew up in that small town, so I was just learning about it, and they're like, oh, you don't really know your Sex Pistols from your suicidal tendencies, get out of here. And so I that really taught me that, like, hey, people have their own starting place. And so I think that has always made me more accepting of that. But I did realize you were talking a while back about Star Wars and the negativity around The Last Jedi. I do have my own version of being defensive about the genres that I love. And for me, it's when I feel like people are really missing the heart of what something is about. So when I saw people viciously attacking the actress that plays Rose because they could not see her as a part of Star Wars canon. Some of them, I think, just out of ignorance and not being open to new ideas, and some of them, because it was so well organized, and I know the way that online hate works, has to be out of actual weaponized racism. It just made me think, have you ever seen a Star Wars movie? Do you not see who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and that they are fighting against oppression and authoritarianism? And so that, to me, that's what gets my blood hot and makes me a little too hasty in my reaction sometimes, because if you step back from the real ugliness of it, it's totally legitimate for some people to not be that excited about certain characters in a movie. And I'll get myself worked up to the point of, like, if you don't love Finn and Rose like I do, there is something wrong with you. So I try to pull myself back from that and just go ahead and love them myself. And that realize that not everybody is actually having an evil agenda. Some people just have wrong opinions.
But it's weird. It's a double-edged thing, because like your protectiveness of Finn and Rose is at once beautiful because you love the characters, but also, yeah, the moment you say, well, you don't get it if you don't get this, that to me kills any discussion of anything. But in pop culture, It's like, well, if you're going to tell someone they don't get it just because they disagree, that's a weird argument. But it's weird. You're walking that line almost there with your Finn and Rose fandom. And it's weird because on the one side, it is wonderful to be that caring about characters that you defend them. But that other side of it, that's why when you said the punk scene, I'm like, well, that's a scene I would assume is very vicious in its, because that's a scene built on being an outsider, but it's cool to be a punk outsider. At least that's how I always viewed it. Those were the characters in movies I liked and whatever.
Right.
But those are very equatable to a degree. And so it's interesting that that's the one that it sounds like, and if I misunderstood what you said, please correct me, but it sounds like that's the one that kind of opened your eyes to not insulating yourself in pop culture. Would that be a correct understanding of what you said, or am I throwing something else in there?
No, you nailed it.
To tie it back to what started this all, which was I was impressed that you actively work towards positivity and talking about pop culture, which isn't something I can completely do, but I very much admire it. I think that the negativity in pop culture comes solely from ownership of pop culture. For whatever reason it is, something as simple as this is the story I relate to something where it's like it's a boys club, it's a whatever club. I guess that ownership of pop culture, because it used to be such an intangible thing, the negativity stems from someone else. We become less special if someone else has it. And that's, I think, putting ourselves too much into the culture. But I feel, at least for me, that's where that stems from or would come from.
I think I have the perfect antidote for that reaction when you see someone who is in their 20s and they are rocking your old-time faves, and you feel like they don't have the same background as you. Forget about the kids in their 20s and just focus on the younger kids, because how can you be mad seeing a 5-year-old with a Spider-Man t-shirt? And don't you want to see another generation of fans appreciating these things?
The danger of nostalgia is that ownership and forgetting that by the time I got to say Spider-Man, he had already been around for 20 years. Other people had gotten to him first. These things are forever changing for the audience. And the negativity, I don't think, can be eliminated. But you're right. I think having that mindset, you're going to sound like a jerk if you're mad at a 5-year-old for liking something that's different from how you remember it or liking the recent iteration. So thank you, man. And thank you both for being on the show. I think we will wrap it up. My regret is we didn't get to talk about the Flash Gordon Minute, which is the podcast that I first heard you on, Brad. That's how I found out who you were. Very quickly, just because I'm going to put a link in the show notes, can you guys just Flash Gordon Minute, what is it? What is that show? And then we'll go out after that.
Again, I'm going to toss this to Jarf. He's the producer of the show.
So yes. Flash Gordon Minute is a movies by minute podcast looking at the 1980 cult classic Flash Gordon with the amazing soundtrack by Queen. So if you're not familiar, I know that you personally are, Jim, but if listeners aren't familiar with the movies by minute genre, so it started out with Star Wars Minute, and it is literally looking at a movie 1 minute per episode. So it might seem, and I know that my wife thinks that this topic is crazy limiting, but you would be surprised how many things there are to talk about in just 1 minute. It just becomes a jumping off point to talk about the actors, the producers, the costuming. And then as these fun conversations among friends go on any kind of rambling side thought from things that are related. It's a deep dive. You really get to focus in. Brad is the co-host along with Eric, who is a real Flash Gordon specialist, so he always brings a lot of great trivia related to the actors and the franchise. And then we have an amazing array of guests. We've really worked hard to make sure that it isn't all just dudes talking about Flash Gordon all the time, and so we've really tried to include more women in the conversation, and had some guests from other Movies by Minute podcasts, so they kind of know that format, and then writers and comedians and the folks from outside of it. And it's a chance to hear some people really heavily invested in Flash Gordon talk about it, and then some people that are new to it and get their different take on it. So we have a lot of fun.
Awesome. And Jarf, you're the voice that introduces it, right? Are you the very voice at the very beginning, or no?
Yes, I do voiceover for the intros and the outros, which is a dream for me. I always wanted to do voiceover, and I've always been inspired by hammy old-time radio voiceover, so that's my inspiration.
I'm very happy to be speaking to the opening voice of that show, and Brad, the actual voice of that show as well. So thank you both for being on this 20th Century Popcast, the show. We do it weekly. You can find us at www.20popcast.com. Check that out. There's links to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, other players, Android apps. You can find me on Twitter at Subcultist. You can find me on Instagram at Subcultist. Just check out 20popcast.com. That's got the information there. Brad and Jarf, do you guys, I'm going to connect in the show notes, but please plug Flash Gordon Minute, plug where people can follow you, because I'm hoping people jump from the show into one or both of your shows.
You can follow us on Twitter at Flash Gordon Pod. That's actually how I connected with you, Tim. So I really like to interact with fans there, and we also post the shows there. We have a Facebook group for our listeners, so they can share funny photos and observations from the show and memes and whatnot, and that's called the Flash Gordon Minute Listeners Vortex.
And Cosmic Geppetto, CosmicGeppetto.com is our website that we're sort of refiguring out. Jarf he's become our social media guy. He's going to be starting to add some content to that at some point in the future. But it's on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. We're on Twitter at Cosmic_Geppetto, and we have the Cosmic Geppetto listeners page. Tim, we expect you to come on Cosmic Geppetto. One thing that we do that we would love to have you on, because you're a fan of the 90s, is we have our Best of the 90s tournament.
Sounds competitive, but okay.
I've been on twice and I've lost twice. It is competitive.
It's a group of 18, and it's our favorite TV shows, movies, and music and cartoons, and they face off until we get to the final two. Jarf, he represented Mystery Men against Army of Darkness, and
How'd you lose that? No, I love Mystery Men, but I think I'm the other person who loves Mystery Men, and that might be why. No, I would love to be on it, man. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, we have a great time. It's very positive. It's very inclusive. And we ask everyone, give us a listen.
So please do. Yes. Again, links will be in the show notes. Hop over to that. Thank you both for not talking about soundtracks today, as was the topic. And, I'll come back next week by myself and probably just read the notes that I had because they were fascinating. But thank you guys. Thank you both.
Yeah, this has been a blast. Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot, man. This is great.
Flash, are you getting it? Over.
Oh, my head. Oh, Flash, if it only was you.
She's not getting me.
Don't use your mouth. Use your brain.
I'm with you, Dale. Just concentrate hard and think to me.
Where are you?
In a rocket, racing to Arborea to get help. Are you okay? Over?
I'm locked in Ming's bedroom.
Oh my God, this girl's really turning me on.
I didn't quite get that. Think it again.
Forget I thought it. It wasn't about you. Over.
What?